Well, another town takeover in eastern Ukraine as the acting president in Ukraine says that they are, quote, helpless in defending the country against the takeover of several towns by pro-Russian forces. I'm joined now by Christian Lepret, associate professor at Royal Military College in Kingston. Thank you for joining me, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let's start off with the acting president's comments on their helplessness in defending against the pro-Russian troops. Are we watching the eastern border of Ukraine essentially devolve into anarchy, sir?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's devolving into anarchy. It just means that the government in Kiev has effectively, and I mean, we've all been able to observe this over recent weeks, has effectively lost control over certain parts of the country, not over the entire region. So around Slavyansk, for instance, the Ukrainian military continues to have roadblocks and has sort of quasi-encircled the town. So it's not like it's completely slid from their control, like they've completely abrogated sovereignty, but it means clearly that there's contestation in terms of sovereignty and who controls the region. And this is really meant to show that the government in Kiev is ineffectual. It's meant to destabilize Kiev and to show really that the government in Kiev has no legitimacy. And ultimately, I think the game plan is to show that we can carry out elections at the end of May, to scuttle the effort to have a democratic sort of legitimized process, and also to scuttle the effort to have a referendum on effectively national unity at the end of May.
Now, we should mention that elections are coming up on May 25th. Canada will be among those nations sending observers. But before then, May 9th, Putin is scheduled to visit Crimea. Crimea, debatably different than the about dozen towns along the eastern border that have been taken over. But I want to get your opinion. What is needed to help the pro-Russian, I'll be honest, I have no problem calling them what they are, which is essentially Russian henchmen that have been imported there. State Department seems to agree with me. What is needed on the ground to stop this rollover of a sovereign national border?
So there's two dimensions here. So Crimea is clearly different from eastern Ukraine in the sense that Crimea had a large majoritarian population that's strongly identified with Russia and Russian links, and there was strong sort of quasi support within Russia for effectively annexing Crimea because Russians had never accepted the 1954 abdication by Khrushchev of Crimea to the Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is quite different. The Russian majority is much smaller in many cases, just a little bit over 50%, although there are more Russian speakers than that. It's also a colleague of mine in Latvia has called this a demographic war, that it's the old folks that feel their affinities with Russia. They're sometimes the people who still remember German tanks rolling through the streets, and those are the people that the quasi sort of separatists, the agents provocateurs, are trying to court. The younger Russians, most of them seem to see their future in Europe and towards the West, and so there's not sort of this unity among the Russian population in eastern Ukraine that we have in Crimea. And at the same time, the sort of Russian efforts, the games that are being played in eastern Ukraine are quite controversial within Russia and Russian society itself. And I think this is partially why Russia is treading carefully here in terms of posturing militarily, but at the same time not actually staging sort of full-scale invasion, because it's not clear that there's broad-scale support within the Russian population for massive sort of military intervention. And so what I think Moscow and what the pro-Russian agents provocateurs are trying to play for is to avoid Ukraine turning west, turning towards Europe, and likely the end game is going to be some sort of neutrality for Ukraine, even though, of course, the ideal end game for Moscow is going to be to make sure that Ukraine is part of its Eurasian trade pact that it intends to sign in the spring here and wants to have in effect by January 2015, and the broader sort of Eurasian treaty organization that Putin has envisaged as a counterpart to NATO, and that has been really part of Putin's grand strategic plans since the 1990s.
Now, on the topic of Eurasian unions, is there a possibility that there is more than an economic alliance at hand now? And what I'm pointing to now are the war games being staged jointly between China and Ukraine. Currently, both have decided to conduct joint naval drills in the East China Sea, where we know China right now has been essentially at least verbal war, closing international waterways and so on with Japan over little islets there. Are we seeing a realignment militarily of old Soviet communist alliances now? And are we in the West doing precious little about it?
Well, I think we also need to be careful here. So President Lukashenko of Belarus, where Putin has just paid a visit, has been fairly vocal in his opposition towards what is happening in Ukraine, because he understands full well in a country like Belarus that also has a significant Russian minority that his own country could effectively be dismembered. We have the same sort of happening in Kazakhstan, where the Kazakh president is sort of highly ambivalent about what's happening in Ukraine. And I think what is happening there is making a lot of people in the region quite nervous. And we've also seen at the same time this rapprochement between China and Russia. But at the same time, it's not clear, for instance, that the Chinese want a rapprochement with a Russian president who's quite happy to use natural resource exports, for instance, to try to extort other countries to do what he wants them to do. And so I sense there's a lot of apprehension, even among some of Putin's close allies, about the strategy that is being pursued in Ukraine. And so it is not clear that this is having the sort of unity effect, the collective action sort of effect that I think Moscow is trying to achieve. And as I've always said, that I think Vladimir Putin might be a decent tactician, but I'm not sure how good he is a grand strategist of thinking multiple steps ahead of what sort of the unintended consequences of these types of maneuvers might be. And ultimately, military prowess is only going to get you so far.
Yeah, well, I would argue that his approval ratings are over 80% right now. So, I mean, national chauvinism and rhetoric has not been higher, at least in the past decade or so. But perhaps it doesn't just mean that we don't have to just look to Putin's abilities as some sort of military strategist, but also Obama's isolationism and unwillingness to become involved in a meaningful way in that area of the world.
So, okay, so two things here. Putin's approval rating, I mean, in Russia, if somebody called me for my opinion on President Vladimir Putin, I'd probably be saying that I'd be a big fan as well, because you never know how many intelligence agencies are listening in on the conversation. So let's just be cautious about the numbers here. With regards to President Obama, so Angela Merkel is on a 2-day visit in Washington, actually, as we speak, today and tomorrow. And I think what we see from President Obama is the same that we've seen, for instance, with regards to Syria, with regards to Libya. We see this sort of leading from behind on the one hand, so that I think the point people on this have become the Germans. They seem to have the greatest sway. The former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, was just in Moscow, had a very cordial, friendly visit with Putin. So Angela Merkel speaks fluent Russian, Vladimir Putin speaks fluent German. So I think part of what we see from Obama is sort of working through the Germans, and the Germans have had a long sort of approach with regards to the Russians of more sort of a dialogue and détente, really dating back to the 1960s versus confrontation. The Germans have been hesitant about enacting too much in terms of sanctions. On the one hand, not to antagonize the Russian bear. On the other hand, because so much of their own economy hinges on it. And at the same time, we see a very interesting, I think, strategy from the Americans. If we look at the sanctions that have been imposed, these sanctions are deliberately targeting Vladimir Putin's personal wealth, which is estimated at some $40 billion US. And all the people that have been targeted are people who are either controlling companies in which Putin has a personal stake, or they're controlling parts of his own personal financial wealth. And so the message the West is sending is that we know exactly where your money is, and what you're doing, we're going to make it hurt personally. We're going to make sure that your money is on the line with any moves that you make here. And so you better think carefully about how much your money is really worth to you, because we're going to try to impose as much personal harm on you as we possibly can. I think it's a very interesting strategy, and I don't think it would have been impossible without very good intelligence provided by the Americans and without a very good strategy worked out within the Treasury Department about how to maximize financial harm for Vladimir Putin without sanctioning him personally.
And it's going to be a double-edged sword, as Vladimir Putin can, of course, make it hurt for the rest of the world with his Gazprom exports. Professor, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your comments and opinions today.
Thanks for having me.